Friends, last week we started our session by honoring and calling the grandmothers. Thank you again, Makgati. And of course, we referenced the fact that we had just come out of International Women's Day and all the symbolism involved with that. So we're so privileged this week, such beautiful timing, beautiful universal timing around the series, that on Saturday, I think, we kicked off with the International Anti-Racism Week. And this week culminates on the public holiday on Sunday, the 21st of March. So we're in International Racism Week, and we wanted to acknowledge that as we stepped into our conversation this evening. And I also wanted to acknowledge the protests, the student protests that are happening across the country at the moment. And the complexity and the wicked problems, the unsolvable problems, the interlocking transcontextual realities that bring us to a situation like that. And so tonight's invocation, to start us off, I'm wanting to share a prayer with you from a lovely book, a book that I love, Desmond Tutu, an African prayer book. I love this book. I go back to it so often. And I want to acknowledge this evening an anti-apartheid activist, a Black Sash activist, Margaret Nash, who passed on in 2011. She was also a member of the Council of Churches. So she straddled also that world of social justice and of spirituality. And I want to offer her prayer this evening as we start our conversations. And it's entitled, May Anger and Fear Turn to Love. O God, whose son in anger drove the money changers from the temple, let the anger of Nkwenkwe Nkomo and his fellow detainees be to the cleansing of this land. O God, I hold before you the anger, the rage, the frustration, the sorrow of Mrs. Nkomo and all Black mothers who demand for their children the same chance to grow up strong and tall, loving and unafraid as any white mother wants for her children. In penitence, I offer you my own mixed up anger. That it, with theirs, may be taken up into your redemptive will, in which the clash between anger and fear, oppressed and oppressor, can give way to the incomprehensible action of love, bringing about reconciliation, the embrace of the other, the alien, the enemy, creating the festival of Shalom, in which the wolf shall lie down with the lamb, and the whole of life on earth shall rejoice in the splendor of your glory. And so may it be. And so may our conversations this evening be blessed. And may our anger and our fear turn to love. Sure. Makgati, back to you.
Thank you. Amen. As you were reading that invocation, I felt my being, the power of my own being, of my body, of the totality of my being used as a tool of transmutation. The very race used as a tool for transmutation of our anger, our hatred, our disappointments, our disconnection, to be able to transmute all of that and turn it into love. Thank you. Thank you. And I want to reference, to bring us back a little bit to a reminder. We recognize that perhaps there's a few people who have joined us for the first time tonight. And we want to assist you to bridge over into joining this space by sharing with you how we have entered into an agreement with one another regarding how we show up in this space and how we communicate with one another in this space. And what we have asked for and what we have agreed on is that we bring the truth of our story to this space. We can only transmute that which is received and looked at in reality. And it's only when we are able to speak with deep vulnerability, to show up with deep vulnerability and with deep authenticity, that we can start perhaps listening to one another and perhaps start that very difficult act of hearing one another. So as we go through these talks, one of the reminders I'm going to give around contracting is that let's keep showing up. Particularly, let's keep showing up with courage to the stories that we would rather not look at, the internal frame that holds up our anger, our hatred, our disappointments, our distancing and disconnection. When we look at those with courage and with a conviction that this has to go because it is not serving all of us, this has to go, perhaps we can start getting there so that it isn't just, we're not working only with hope, and hope is beautiful. It is one of those vehicles that moves us forward, but that we actualize the hope into action and we can start taking those steps. Are there any others, Ilze, that you would like to reflect on some of our contracting?
I think just this, what we've spoken about in the previous sessions about how this is the quote that I shared last week, you know, my pain is not your classroom. And just to understand that we don't come into these conversations from an equal place, from similarly situated, and that we are on sacred ground, that we're not entitled to have these conversations with anybody we choose, that we cannot have them necessarily on our own terms, that we have to approach them with humility and with deep gratitude for the gift that Black people give us by continuing to show up.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. And that brings us to the homework that we asked you to do as we left one another last week. You know, the homework around what gets left behind, what do you get gifted? And what we asked you was go and find out. Take that inward journey and find out, what is it? What have I inherited? And how have I used my inheritance? And the inheritance can be physical, it can be in terms of spiritual or emotional, however way. But what is it that you have inherited from your context, from your bloodline, from your race, that, and how have you used that to progress through life or to be held back in life? And with that, I'm going to share an experience that I know I have inherited, and we've already spoken about this, so it won't be news to you, but certainly a big piece of being Black that I have had to work, not work against, to embrace it and make space for it, even though it has worked against me, is the sense of a diminished self. It is a sense of an oppressed identity. And it is an identity that has continued to make me diminish myself and not speak up when I know I should have spoken up. So I've watched my life in the last while. It's only recently that I've taught myself to stop that nonsense, and to stop believing the voice of my tribe and the tribe of the other that has determined who I am. But for the longest time, I have just kept quiet. I have smiled. I have carried on as if everything is okay, because I have not felt my own power. I have not been able to experience myself as a powerful being, as a sovereign being. And, and that has removed me from an experience of myself, and removed me from my experience of myself as a sure, as an aspect of divinity. And my journey of spirituality is very much aligned with my journey through race, and it's that journey that is bringing me back home, and it's the home that I never really left, because it's the home that says that I am home in the lap of God, of divinity. So the inheritance, in fact, has assisted me to chart my journey through. And it is me using the inheritance to spin it on its head and use it, in fact, to reclaim myself. And I think this brings us into a conversation about the chakras. But before we go into that, Ilze, I don't know if you want to reflect a little bit on your own inheritance.
Thanks, Makgati. Yes, sure. Um, when we spoke last week, we were talking about sort of intergenerational wealth. We wanted to, I was still wanting to ask a question about black tax and about, there's so many unfinished conversations from the previous sessions. And then you put this beautiful reframing on this idea of inheritance, and your inheritance of your gift of healing, and then that led us to this whole along this whole journey to ask of our friends, our participants in this conversation, what have we inherited? And I spent some time thinking about it again this week, and I one of the things that I've inherited, and Cindy will know about this as well in some of the coaching conversations that we've had, is this almost kind of a curse, this biblical curse almost, of the sins of the fathers, will be visited upon, like generations and generations and generations. And I have felt that very heavily. I've felt that I have felt that I've owed a debt. I inherited a debt. I also inherited a professional qualification, and I also inherited, seed money to buy my first home. I also inherited those things, but I also inherited a debt that has been so heavy and that has really shaped my life. And with that debt, I've also inherited, guilt. That I can't explain and that I don't know what to do with. Um, and the phrase that came up for me was Jonathan Jansen's beautiful book called Knowledge in the Blood. And it's one of those, if this was a workshop or a training course, it would be one of those resources that people would be referred to, because it's such a extraordinary piece of work. And he talks about the knowledge in the blood. This is what you inherit. You inherit that the that world, those worldviews, those prejudices. It sits so deep in you. And yeah, so it has been so it's been a mixed inheritance. And that is something that emerged very clearly for me in this last week. Whereas where I entered into this conversation with you last week, I was kind of only holding, the kind of, the material part of it very strongly in the forefront of my mind. But I've been able to feel more compassionate towards myself, reflecting on this mixed inheritance. Yeah.
Mm.
So yeah, That's from me. And that leads us very beautifully into, of course, this solar plexus, this chakra of the self, the place of personal power and individuation, because we're talking about that. So I'm going to hand back to you
Okay.
to, yeah.
Yeah, Cindy and Ilza have already reminded us that we are journeying through the chakras, through these energy systems. And what I'm appreciating in the story that you've just shared, Ilza, is that there is movement, there is some agitation happening. And this is really what we hope for. This is grace acting upon us, so that these are not just conversations between you and me, but that these are agitations, and perhaps things are moving and being shook up inside of us, so that they can be moved out of the way and be replaced by something else. And I'm having a hot flush. Look at my glasses. Welcome to the mid years, people. So talking about the solar plexus, that seat of personal power, my gosh. Well, how do we talk about that without referencing internalized oppression and, ideas of superiority and ideas of freedom? And I, when we were talking earlier, I was thinking about what the solar plexus means for me and what it has gifted me. And I know that it's a masculine principle, the solar plexus, and it's the sun. Of course, it's the sun. So it's about heat and it's about intensity, and it is that place from which we are able to gather. When the invocation that you read, that reminded us about the anger and the need to take radical action in order to shift a system or a story that no longer works. We're actually talking about the gift that the solar plexus gives us. It hasn't always been like that. For me, absolutely not. I know that for the longest time, I could not connect with my own inner power. I had so much ingested the stories of blackness and the stories of blackness from a diminished perspective. And these are tacit stories. These are not necessarily told stories, but it's those stories that I know are very much alive. Um, when I hear somebody saying, who's that black and that unidentified black walking down this, my white street, or who or what why are these black people protesting again, and why are they burning the streets again? So it's a one-sided sort of diminished source of self that I had tapped into to determine who I am. And I have struggled with that. Because my source of power is strong. I know there's great power in me. I mean, I come from my parents, my mother, from both sides, strong personalities, strong healers. And yet when I came to it, I know that I wanted to just shh, um, because over and above everything else, the first marker of who I am is the skin. And so when somebody experiences me, their own frame of what blackness looks like is what they use to make sense of who I am, and in that way lose out actually on who I am. But I've also participated in that. I know that I have agreed. I have in some ways participated in that until I stopped participating in it, until the power inside of me was so strong that it said, no, what you are doing is not only disrespecting yourself, but you are disrespecting the opportunity to become, that word again, a transmuter of knowledges, the change of knowledges to create transformation. What if, Makgati, what if you showed up in your own full power? And what if the experience that you give to that white person might be the exact experience that they've never had, but that they would benefit from? And that would assist them to start thinking, oh, there's other versions of Black. There isn't just my own diminished perspective of Black. And the more I stepped into my own power and claimed my own power, the more I realized that, oh, I don't have to apologize. Oh, I don't even have to shout. I don't even have to scream. I don't have to shake people up. I mean, I shake them in different ways, but I don't have to hold them and shake them like this, because I know that when I show up and I am full in who I am, that actually what I'm standing on is the wings of a being that says, Makgati, remember you have come into this world to have this experience. So have it, but don't stop there. Have it and see how you can use it to open up and grow. And in your growth, you help others to grow. So that internalized oppression and those stories of Blackness, yes, they are very much alive and with us. But I think that as we move on, as we slowly do our bit, and when I say when we do our own bit, I'm talking about us Black people, when we start questioning our own, the spaces where we agree, maybe by not speaking up, agree to our own oppression by not speaking up, by not showing up, by not embracing our own selves, there's a shift happening, and it's a necessary shift. And so the message to white people: know that if you have a very limited view, that view is going to be shattered. So let's both do our work from the Black perspective. Let's do our work and step into our personal power. From white people's perspective, open up your view and expect that there isn't just one sort of being, even for self. There isn't just one way of whiteness. So there isn't one way of Blackness. Because I think that in the inability to shift and create space, then we start seeing the resurgence of what we're seeing now, with the neo-Nazism and all the devastation that we are seeing, is the refusal to accept that Blackness can be big and profound and immeasurable. So both of us have to do our own work and connect with that inner power. Oh, one last thing that I wanted to say about connecting with that inner power. Perhaps when all of us are able to connect to our own inner power, then we won't have to kneel on somebody's neck in order to steal their power and to feed our own emptiness. I think it's about that. It is seeing what we want, it's out of there, and we don't see that actually we have it inside of us.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so powerful. The the emptiness. I'm going to come back a little bit later to the emptiness, because that idea of emptiness is something that actually in the research has actually been found, really, through research that have been done on during the period of the Holocaust and post-Holocaust. And it's this whole bystander phenomenon, which really helped me make sense and soften my own hardened heart. But that's going to come in the next sort of 15 minutes when we move on to the heart chakra. To stay with this beautiful place of personal power, this beautiful sun, that beautiful healthy ego that you were talking about. There is of course the sort of white corollary, if that's the right word, the kind of the white version of the internalized oppression, which in the literature is referred to as internalized dominance. So in the same way that you were talking about internalizing that diminished self, as white people, we generally internalize quite a grandiose self, quite a narcissistic self, a self that centers itself, that foregrounds itself. And this has this is such an interesting experience, and it's been such an interesting experience for me to deal with my own internalized dominance. I refer to it as my inner white madam, the Karen, the white madam, the Karen that lives within me. And I want to say a bit more about that, but I'm so distracted by my question that I had for you, or by wanting to kind of just bring this concept of Black consciousness into our conversation. I just feel such a strong, I'm kind of feeling spirit-led to, yes, just to say his name, Stephen Bantu Biko, just to say it out loud. And just, this beautiful message of Black consciousnness. And I just think, for many whites, I'm sure many of the whites on this call, are familiar with the Black consciousness movement, familiar with people like Steve Biko, but maybe some aren't. And I just wondered if you wanted to say just a few words about that.
Ooh, gosh, well, I mean, of course, a few words. He obviously, Black consciousness, anti-apartheid, absolutely vehemently opposed and critical of the apartheid government, but also a philosopher, such a learned, beautiful soul, who I think he's one of those people that really got it. He really got it, that the freedom we seek outside of ourselves, the freedom that the end of apartheid was supposed to bring, the freedom that we are all hoping will come when the structures are all dismantled and the sort of like equality across. But I think he was one of those people that also said that we have to do our inner work. We have to do our inner work so that we can meet the change that we are creating externally. That's my kettle whistling, if you can hear a whistling sound. He was very clear that that inner work needs to couple the outer work. And I imagine it as tilling the soil, making the land ready, so that even as the external environment is changing, but that it has a place to land. And that place upon which it lands is ripe enough so that what gets planted there, what gets seeded there, grows in a way that can feed all of us. I don't think that we always have managed to successfully achieve that. I think that of course, structurally, we still see a lot of racist spaces in place that are upholding discrimination and all that. But what I'm taking away from Dade Biko is that invitation that Makgati, he said, Black man, you're on your own. and by Black man, you're on your own, I want to say that he was saying to all humanity, do your inner work. it is not enough to keep taking from one another. It is not enough to to expect that the liberator is going to come from the outside. Liberation happens from within. And when the spaces within are being liberated, um, then really, I mean, and this is my own, this is from my perspective. It may not necessarily be shared by others, but for me, what has happened is that as I have connected with my inner power and have found my own liberation, it's almost like, you know, what is happening outside, well, it can happen. But what I bring into that context is informed by spirit. It's not informed by ego, because my liberation is about touching the guidance of spirit inside of me that reminds me that, Makgati, you are not only a Black person, you are far bigger than that. And so when I listen and I do that inner work, it gives me the discernment to know how to show up in a way that is useful, that is skillful. And useful and skillful can involve clapping, you know, giving administering a very hot smack. It can also involve administering a let me love you. I can see that you are hurting. You have lost your way. You believe you are what you are not. And for me, the person that I am, the language of love and the language of forgiveness, and I know I'm jumping into the heart chakra, but that's the language that I hear and I speak. So I went and hijacked
Beautiful.
Steve Biko big
No,
time there.
listen, wasn't it lovely how the kettles, how wasn't that spirit? I mean, we
Exactly. Exactly.
that was so amazing.
The agitation of the hot water going, yes,
It was
yes.
so amazing. I love that. I love that. That was so amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, so Makgati, you started talking about the love and the heart chakra, and that's where we're going. But I think I do need to just touch on this piece about this sort of differently racialized experience that white people have when you have grown up in a world that reflects your own reality back to you all the time, and your own excellence, your own articulateness, your own worldview, your own, your right to take up space, um, your, you know, I mean, there's the silly example of the flesh-colored band-aid, So you go into the shop and you buy a flesh-colored band-aid because your flesh is the universal norm for flesh color. And so if you grow up in a world where your flesh and your being and your features and your the entire way in which you've been conditioned and socialized and racialized is the norm, is right, is um, is reflected back to you as the dominant kind of worldview. If all progress is attributed to your race, if all excellence is contributed to your race, to your particular accent, to your particular set of table manners, to your, all of those things, then you subconsciously internalize that grandiose sense of self. And you take up space, you are more entitled, you assume you have something of value to add, and you dominate a space unconsciously. You dominate a space. And the for me personally, what has been what has been the real sort of shocking thing to confront is that when we are acting out of that place of unconscious internalized dominance, it is almost, it's inevitable that we are in that process dehumanizing the other people in that space. And it's almost inevitable that our behaviors will constitute these things that we theoretically refer to as microaggressions. Now, many Black people will take issue with that. They'll say that there is no such thing as a microaggression, that it is always a form of psychological violence that, you know, people experience when you behave in those subtle, very subtle ways. You know, you to do with all of these markers that I've mentioned before. Yeah, and so the second thing that was such a sort of a sort of a shocking realization to me was how how much of a default programming it is for me still to this day. And it is not that I am, and here's the trick, here's the thing that might be interesting. It is not so much to do anymore for me with a kind of a racialized skin color, but it has to do with an orientation toward things that we, in a Western context, value more than what gets valued in a more African or indigenous context. So, for example, getting the job done, being on time, uh, you know, sort of, you know, this individualist sort of sense of like having, you know, having to strive, you know, your own individual sort of striving. Um, how often we can become disembodied and disconnected from our own bodies and from nature. And so every time I find that I want to put the task that has to be completed ahead of the relationships, ahead of people that I'm in relation to when having to achieve that task, I know that I'm coming from that internalized dominance. Whenever I am, when I make, you know, when I deal with time in such a scarce, linear kind of way, I know that I'm in my whiteness. Whenever I think that I can achieve something by myself, I'm in my whiteness. And so it is, I'm just amazed at the amount, the subtle ways in which this internalized dominance still manifests on a daily basis, despite the fact that I've done this work for 30 years. It is just so, it's just so deeply entrenched. It's such a deep default setting. And the only thing that I can offer myself is awareness, is to catch yourself in that moment, to pause, to ground, to take a breath and to say, okay, wait, let me first find out, how are you? What's happening? You know, and in that moment, I can feel my body relaxing. I can feel myself grounding. I can feel my heart opening, and I can feel my own humanity return to me as I then also sense the connection with the other. Yeah.
When you were talking, you made me, the thing that I wanted to say was, yeah, let's not underestimate the power that colonialism has had. The colonial task and objective has been incredibly strong and continues to live in us, so that it isn't only living in the skin of whiteness, but it is way beyond that. And so we find that we are now assisting one another to act to act from a position of dominance. You know, whether it's dominating each other through our gender, whether it's dominating the earth and thinking that we can take whatever we want and we are the dominant race as humanity, we can do whatever. You know, that's really about that. It's almost as if there has been once a frame is created, it can form part of a lens, and once it forms that lens, that's it. Then what I see, wherever I look, I see opportunity for dominance, because the lens itself is one that says everybody is here to be dominated over. Even Mother Earth is here to be dominated over and extracted from. Other races are here to be dominated and to be extracted from. Look at how much has been extracted from First Nations all over the world, over and over again, without us even recognizing our connection with one another, without recognizing that, oh, but that's our origin, those are our ancestors. Surely, um, all this intelligence that I have should tell me that by maintaining a disconnection, and it feels like a concerted effort to have humanity be disconnected from itself. Because once we are disconnected, then we've bought into it. It means that then what can be achieved through us in service of a minor few is massive. Because then we don't have to care. We don't have to have compassion. You were talking about that bystander issue earlier on, because it does say it's those people over there. Don't participate. It's not, just take care of your own here. And so we go here, and then we keep looking at the world as an opportunity to take something from the world in order to feed ourselves. Now, if you think of Ubuntu, which we've spoken about several times, and it's not a concept that is often embraced or used any longer, but it really is a reminder that you are connected. You are more than connected. In fact, you are one. And whatever happens in one space, in one race, it's going to have a reverberation and impact another race. Therefore, sort yourselves out, because you are going to need one another. And I think the sooner we wake up to that recognition that we are going to need one another, we need one another. And we need one another not in the sense of, I am the madam and you are the girl in the kitchen. No, not that kind of need. But we need one another as equals. We are meeting one another. And in fact, when we come from a place of meeting one another, perhaps we start recognizing that we can humanize one another. We can bring ourselves back to the humanity that is so sorely missing in our relationship with one another.
And Makgati, what's interesting to me, and I think what I want to say also out loud, is that um, whereas the end point is the same thing, a healthy ego, a powerful personal place of power, the journeys are very different. The journeys are very different, because if you've been racialized white, there is a lot of releasing that has to happen of an aggrandized ego, a lot of grounding that has to happen, a lot of humility and waiting, and a lot of pausing, and a lot of self-reflection that needs to happen. Whereas what I heard you say, from the Black perspective, is that there can be too much of that. There can be too much of that in the diminished self. And, there is an impulse of strength that's needed, that needs to come from the diminished self. But we have to come to this process in very different ways, depending on how we've been racialized, in order to end with that healthy ego. And the thing that I love about the solar plexus, as I was thinking about it for this conversation this evening, is it's also the place where ethics reside, our own value system and our own ethics. So it's where we leave behind the knowledge and the blood. It's where we leave behind the values that have been handed down to us by our tribe, by our family of origin. And it's where we choose our own values, our own ethics. So it's that place of individuation, not individualism, but individuation. And you can only be fully part of a collective if you have individuated.
Yeah.
So, but there is something very different that is being asked of us. And I know that I wanted to still talk about structural racism, but I can see it's almost, I can just keeping my eye on the time. And so I'm wondering if we need to kind of just weave our way into the heart chakra.
Well, I mean, I was wondering that. I was wondering if we actually stay with the solar plexus and perhaps we move into the heart chakra. You know, we grab the two, the heart and the throat, and the other two in our two remaining ones. It feels like there's still a little bit more to be said about the solar plexus. I am on fire.
We just wait for the kettle to go off again.
And I mean, it's in me, the kettle is going off inside of me. But I wanted to say also, you know, when you were reminding us about that individuation and that for Black people, for us Black people, it's about gathering all the fragmented aspects of self that have been cut off, that have been severed in an attempt to diminish our sense of self as far as it is possible. So it's because it's been made that it is almost unsafe to be in a Black body. In fact, it is unsafe to be in a Black body. At any point, you can be stopped. At any point, somebody is feeling anxious because you have suddenly entered the room. And at any point, people are thinking, who is here to steal my whatever, you know. So our sense of security is very much threatened, or white people's sense of security is very much threatened when Black people enter the space and suddenly bags get zipped up, and without thinking, what is this doing to the other person when I behave like that? It, you know, it's so normalized that we don't even question. And the other part of it, of course, is that then I also go, oh, you know, let me remove myself from this space just in case. And I mean, I think I've said this already, but the work then for me is about fetching myself from all these spaces and building up and really locating my sense of power as a right, as as a salient feature of who I am, because that has been taken away in so many different ways. You know, who you are is not okay. Your religion is not okay. The food you eat is not okay. The language you're speaking, listen to us now. The language you're speaking is not okay. More than that, even the wealth that the land upon which you live, we're going to remove it and extract it and make you owe and keep paying in physical money, in currency, but also in emotional currency, in spiritual currency, because even the spirituality you have is not okay. So, absolutely, imagine coming into the world where you are being taught that absolutely everything that you are is not okay. And more than it not being okay, but that remember, it is going to make other people feel anxious. Therefore, shh, tread quietly. Then every single behavior is about, oh, let me reshape myself. Let me reshape myself. Let me put a bigger smile so that I can appear as non-threatening as possible. Until the solar plexus absolutely says, because the solar plexus is saying you have to tap into your own power, the real power that is not subject to whatever is going on outside of you. And it's saying exactly the same thing for white people, which is what you're saying, is that recognize that if you have all of this privilege foisted upon you when you come into the world, doubt that. Step into a space of doubting for both of us. Step into the space of doubting every source of identity that has been placed upon you, that you have been using to define yourself. Doubt every single one of them and be courageous enough to stand in that liminal space of nothingness where you become nothing, where your source of self isn't based on some historical narrative or some ideology that excludes you. And perhaps when we can be courageous enough to stand on that platform of nothingness, of the liminal space, perhaps that's really that moment that grace can act upon us and say, my child, welcome home. I know the way. And perhaps that's when we can be taken by the hand and really be brought to the truth of who we are. And because these conversations are about spirit led, we really can only hope that we are being watched and that our prayers are being heard. Our prayers for really knowing who we are being heard, and that we can be guided. But we can only be guided once we loosen our clutches on who we think we are and be able to step in a space of nothingness and emptiness and float there for a while and just see. And perhaps the place that we land is back on that lap of divinity that says, welcome home. Now you can
Makgati,
go back and do beautiful work in the world.
in the world. Now you can go back and do beautiful work in the world. I love that. Now you can go back. Now you can go back and do beautiful work in the world. But Makgati, before we kind of come to the end of the hour, I mean, what you have said is so beautiful. I can actually feel in my own body, you know, a sense, almost, it's almost like there's a kind of a permission that you've given me to be able to just move subtly, out of that burden of whiteness, and to kind of just move, just to feel like, for me to reconnect really in that liminal space. I actually felt that in my body. Um, what's coming up for me that I'd like to, if I may, put
Yes.
into the space in the last few minutes that we have, is that I'm I'm worried that, or I don't want to, how do I frame this? I don't want to maybe leave our participants and our friends that we're in conversation with an idea that racism is primarily a psychological issue.
Mm, mm,
That's what's coming up for me. Um, because I think it is so important for us to understand that the psychological impact is the consequence of the structural racism that we have in society.
mm,
And the structural racism that we have in society are all these interlocking systems, these trans-contextual interlocking systems of life as we know it, that reflects glory onto whiteness and reflects abjection onto blackness.
mm,
But what was such a incredibly important insight for me,
mm,
and it's not very, it's actually, it's quite recent, it's actually in the last couple of years only that I've really come to grapple with this. In my early days of doing this work, I believed fervently in the power of awareness raising, of education, our unconscious biases, if we could just heal our wounds. And I that was sort of where I focused a lot of my work. But what I'd forgotten is my early days of activism, my early days of being a human rights lawyer, where we understood that the changes that needed to happen were structural. And I've kind of come back to that place. And the person that's inspired me is this American scholar, Ibram Kendi. And he wrote a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's one of his books, which I can completely and utterly recommend. Oh, I was spitting. If anybody was close to me now, they would have been spat upon. Um, I can completely recommend his book. And what he reminds us about is that racism was invented to justify slavery.
Mhm.
And slavery was necessary to provide labor for capitalist and powerful interests. So it is very important for us to understand that prior to the kind of 17th century, 16th 17th century, racism was not really a thing, and that it really was a cultivated, it was actually cultivated through stories, narratives, books, to justify
Mm.
free labor and exploitation. And then, of course, it became a self-perpetuating system. Then it became a self-perpetuating living system. And I think that we have to be so careful in these conversations that we don't end the conversation at the place of the inner work, because we need also to be very clear that if we are not taking steps in the external world, active anti-racist steps to
Yeah.
actively challenge the structural arrangements, we are in fact continuing to collude. And our solar plexus, which is about ethics and which is about our value system, will continue to be compromised
Mhm.
by this dissonance, by this contradiction.
Mm.
And when I talk about taking active steps structurally in the world, I'm talking about challenging things like, why am I living in a block of flats that's only got white people? Like, how is that possible? Like, what is subtly going on here that, you know, black tenants are finding it difficult to actually be in this block of flats, which would then create a different reality for everybody who lives in the block of flats, and which would then be a kind of a rupture of that kind of that world that reinforces whiteness in the way that I know it. You know, what about hiring practices? What about movies? What about um, you know diversity at schools? What about um, you know all these real structural things? Um, are we challenging those?
Mm.
Because it's only if we change the way the world looks that we will be able to create, that we'll be able to break, that we'll be able to disrupt this self-perpetuating kind of dynamic of the internalized oppression and the internalized dominance. So I wanted to just throw that in the last few
Yes.
minutes.
Yes, and I'm going to take half a minute to just say, not to just say, but to say that that I'm interested in what it is that enabled racism to take hold when it was first introduced in the first place. And so I'm advocating for that inner work because I'm interested. What is it in us, humanity, that would not only allow for the seeds to take root, but to perpetuate it, to keep it alive so well that we are having these conversations how many years later? So I think so the outer work and the inner work, they need to support one another so that we don't repeat the same thing by us not questioning what it is in us that makes this possible. Yeah, I'm interested in what is it, even before then, what
Yeah.
is it about us humanity that has enabled this? And how can we release ourselves of that? And perhaps when we release ourselves of this, we we start seeing that, hang on, things are not okay in the outer world. And how can I participate in creating structures that are that reflect my inner cleanliness? Ooh, I'm using such big word, big language. My inner openness, my inner whateverness that is more in support of equality.
Thanks,
Mm.
Makgati. Isabel, the book is called How to Be an Anti-Racist. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. How to Be an Anti-Racist, which has really been a really eye-opening book.
Mm.
So when Makgati and I were thinking about this evening, we were really asking again to be spirit-led around what wanted to be, how we wanted to end the session. And a very bizarre thing happened. I got led to a book of poetry that I was given at school, a book of poetry that was published in 1976 by a very Afrikaans poet called Lina Spies. And it's an Afrikaans poem that I don't think was ever intentioned to be read with a political lens. But it felt so powerful for me to take those words that were born from apartheid and born out of an apartheid language and born in an apartheid time with somebody who didn't have probably much of a political consciousness at that time, and to use those words in service of our conversation this evening. There was something very powerful for me about that. And there was, I'm on this journey with my mother tongue, with Afrikaans. So we thought that I would share it in Afrikaans, the way it was originally written. And then I did a little translation of it in English. And it's just about 8 lines long, so it hopefully won't take too long. So it's called wond, which is wound in Afrikaans, wond. Seermaak dinge word later toemaak goed. Ook dapperes is bang vir bloed. Mens draai die verbande om, hou jou doof, swyg jou stom, maar soms in die nag maak jy dit oop en kyk daarna. Hoe uit die barsies in die roof dit vogtig aanhou dra. Hurtful things become cover-ups. Even the courageous ones are afraid of blood. You change the bandages, keep deaf and dumb, but sometimes in the deepest dark, you open it up and look at it stark. How through the fissures in the scabbing, moisture moves, continuously seeping.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Mm.
Really lovely. And what a wonderful evening. Thank you for sharing. And I think for me, the solar plexus is just such a good place to stay, because this is where, where we feel uncomfortable, where the knots are. And the element of the solar plexus is fire. So it is that anger, it is that fire, it is those feelings. And I have to say, there is a feeling of uncomfortability. I think we've got to the place where it really sits within us. I'd like to take a couple of the questions. We'll take the first one from the Q&A. What will it take for whites to step out of their privileged comfort zone?
It'll take the recognition of your comfort zone, and it will take the courage of making space for that comfort zone to be big enough to accommodate everyone, not just your loved ones, but in particular the one that you disapprove of, the one that you would rather not invite into that comfort zone. But first it has to be seen. It has to be. It's not enough for white people to say, oh, I'm not racist, or I don't see color. and not acknowledge the privilege.
I think we're both taking a stab at the answer. I think Makgati was giving her insights, but I'd love to add mine. I don't think, my genuine feeling is that the only thing that will help whites to move out of their sense of privilege is to be completely ignored. And for Black people to step into their power and to do what they need to do and to step into leadership as far as possible. It is such a prison. It is such a prison. And it really takes some kind of rupture, some kind of disruptive experience. And I have seen how persistent and tenacious, I'm trying to think of all of those words, relentless, that prison of white privilege is. Even after people have, had an awakening. I'm thinking back last year to the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and all the outrage and all the performative allyship and all the optical allyship and, all the outrage. And, where is all of that gone? All those white people, all those consultants, all those, corporate leaders, all of those people that were, having sessions with their staff and, launching, some kind of, having some kind of performative response. Where is it all gone? Where is all that energy gone? It's all dissipated, and people have just, that sense of white privilege has just, it protects you. It it's self-perpetuating. So I don't know, Veronica, I don't know, and Veronica, I respect Veronica and the work that she does so much, and I don't know, I think this is maybe a much longer conversation that we could have, but that would be, that's a kind of a little touch in of my kind of personal experience and personal feeling around the persistence of white privilege, the self-perpetuating persistence of white privilege, which is not to say we should give up. It's not to say, that we give up. It's not to say that we don't hold a vision of a different kind of society, but we've got to be very skillful with our energies. And we've got to be, and particularly, I think, Black people, it would, it is a very, it's a monster with multiple heads.
Yeah. I wanted to add just one thing around the invitation to us Black people to step into our own power, that that remembering, of course, that who gets listened to is also very much race-based. And so even as Black people step into spaces that it takes a lot of work to stay in those spaces, because even then, whoever gets consulted, whoever gets listened to is over there. It's the white person standing behind the Black leader or the Black whoever. So it is really about cleaning up these internal lenses and making space for whatever authority or whatever it is. Your own, that limited sense opens up a whole lot more, so that you really can get to see that authority is not just one thing, and that wealth is not just one thing, but that all of us, Black people and white people, can participate in that.
So we have some information going on in the chat. I was quite triggered when Makgati was asked to answer, as we Black people are often asked to make whites aware of their impact. this is rewounding.
Mm.
And I'm not sure how you would like to respond to that, or how you feel.
Yeah. Sorry, who did you ask?
I think you must intuitively answer, guys. I mean, I don't. This is what it's all about, and why
Yeah.
we've asked people to ask questions is
Yeah.
because this uncomfortability sitting in our audience,
Right. Right.
in this safe space, needs to be
Yeah.
addressed.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have, when I answered, I mean, I don't, let me not speak for you because you're right here, Ilze, but I offered from my own perspective and from what I have seen. And in my addition to your invitation to Black people, my addition was, remember, even as white people, this takes time. Wait, what you hold can also be part of what gets in the way of creating the change that we all seek. So I stepped in with my own, yeah, with my own sense of wisdom and understanding. And it's just a perspective.
And I
Yeah,
think,
and I think it's so wonderful that this question is raised because, from my perspective, this is a beautiful moment where two realities collide. So it's this paradox of doing this work and being in these conversations. So the part of me that wants to hold back and that doesn't want to step in, that white madam that has to be, kept quite a tight rein, has to be kept on her to not just step into the space and make assumptions. So that person was in a slight bit of tension with a person who felt this question was probably directed to me as the white panelist. And
Mm.
so do I just step in, or do I hold back? Do I step in, or do I hold back? And that is part of doing this work, is that question. Do I step in? Is this my turn to speak? Is this where I can make a contribution, or is this for me to hold back? But I think that this is a beautiful example of how difficult this work is, and thank you to the person who put that in the chat, because that, I think it's still Veronica, because that rewounding is an absolute phenomenon. And it is an absolute phenomenon, and I want to completely own that.
maybe a complex philosophical question. I'm writing with a sense of contradiction around white people's internalized dominance. On the one hand, the obvious truth that white people grew up with their superiority being reflected to them in every respect. On the other hand, Makgati's very pertinent point 2 weeks ago that whites have been propped up and not developed the resilience that people of color have.
Mm.
Isn't this internalized dominance actually a show that we white people put up for ourselves to prevent us from seeing our weakness as whites?
Yeah. But that's exactly the conversation that reminds us that the work has to be done by both of us, by both parts, precisely because of that all of this dominance possibly comes from a sense of emptiness. This is when I mentioned the word emptiness earlier on. It possibly comes from a sense of emptiness, a sense of not beingness, and in order to help mediate against that, then there is all of this padding and this propping up, and that is the very thing then that has to be let go of in order to really land in the space of one's own body and be a fully embodied spirit. But it takes work. And it also means then that the deeper the sense of emptiness and the fear of stepping in the space of emptiness, the bigger the propping up will be.
And I think on the back of that, that transmuting that energy by just doing a little bit, what you were talking about, the spiritual work earlier, because I've been sitting here feeling very overwhelmed tonight with the conversation, to be very honest, around, hold on, my colonialism, and sort of all of a sudden those cogs have started moving around that. And it's so, okay. But I need to start within, showing up, being here, starting to ask the questions. And I think, that that internal, because it's so big,
Hmm.
and we just have to do this one bite at a time, and do that. So we have another question, um, a little bit around that, and around, leading on to that. How do we actually begin the process of peeling the layers of ourselves to begin to feel safe to face the ego, either as our self diminishing or self grandiose? The fear of stripping yourself naked and opening up is real, and is a roadblock for many to meet themselves. This in turn makes it even more hard to peel layers of our experiences with others. Who am I oppressed by, or oppress myself to get the safe zone of love? How do we actually begin?
I think that question itself is a powerful, powerful beginning. And it is sending messages to the inner self to say that perhaps we can approach the starting point. When we start vocalizing what we would like to get to, and don't even know where to start, I think that beginning part of vocalizing it is incredibly powerful. I think you start where you are. I think some of these questions that we've been asking you, these are our way. The homework that we're giving you. This is our way of assisting you to start peeling the layers of who you are not, in order to finally, hopefully, arrive at the place at that self that you are. But ask questions, and it can be questions to your immediate family about who you are and how far back you go to. It can also be deep inner questions, and really examining your own triggers. What happens when you are in the space of another who does not look like you? What are your responses like? What invites those responses? What do you eventually do? So when we start paying attention to our triggers and to our responses to the triggers, that already is part of the information that is coming through to say, okay, so this is how I see the world. Is this working? Maybe not. Perhaps I can start looking at another way. So questioning, paying attention and questioning how we see the world and how we respond to the world. And it is an ongoing journey. I think it's an ongoing journey of the soul. I think this is why we've come here on earth. We have come to learn, and learn we must. So it's not okay to sit in the space that we have been put on, but to really just question, what's my response, what's my contribution, how are people responding to me, how am I responding to people?
I think what I want to add to that, Makgati, is I think from a white perspective, is that when you start doing this work, I think it is very important to in a way almost put some time aside to grieve.
Mm.
That is really where it starts, is with grief. This is not, you it starts with the grief of what we have done to ourselves, what we have done to others. In our lineages, we have both been oppressed and oppressors. We have within each of us oppressed and oppressors. Part of what we're journeying towards is this kind of wholeness that we've been talking about. That's part of what we're journeying towards. But I think it starts with grief. When as a white person, you have to fully confront the peels that fall from your eyes. and what you consider to be normal is an absolute, it is a crime against humanity. It is a travesty of injustice. It is an unspeakable horror. And you have lived your life as if this was the norm. And when you get to that place where you have to begin to confront what a setup this all has been, and at what price, at what cost, there is a grieving, and we have to give ourselves time for that. We have to give ourselves time for that grieving, in order to kind of then move from that place forward. So I would say immerse yourself in the pain of what has brought us to this point. What has brought us to this point?
Oh, thank you, Ilse. We don't have any more questions, so I'd like to thank you both for putting yourselves in the hot seats and taking questions. It's a difficult conversation, so we really appreciate the answers. I have one more question. Is there homework for us?
Yes, there is.
Let's start that peeling somewhere, please, Makgati.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the homework, I've written it down somewhere. The homework is, who is the person I find difficult to love? Who is the one I find difficult to love and embrace and welcome? What is that doing to you and to that other? And where would you like to get to with that? Who is the one you find difficult to love?
And adding to that, Makgati was going to hold the inner work piece, and I was going to hold the outer work piece. We invite each of you, that you see, we've still got 22 of our participants still on the call. So because this is Human Rights Anti-Racism Week, and because it culminates in Human Rights Day on Sunday, we want to invite each of you to see whether life presents you with an opportunity this week to perform one courageous anti-racist act. And by that, we mean a structural, we mean challenging something that is normative, something that is structurally has just been the way it's been. It might be something at your children's school. It might be something to do with the neighborhood where you live. It might be something in the grocery store where you go to do your groceries. But see whether life presents you. Be on the alert and see what life presents you with, an opportunity to step into your courage, into your solar plexus, and to make one action that is aligned with your own ethics, with your own individuated value system, one that believes fundamentally in the absolute inherent equality and dignity and divinity of all people. And take one action in the world to disrupt something in the world that perpetuates the distortion of that.
Wow. That is going to be fascinating. Makgati, Ilse, thank you so much for your time, your effort, your commitment to the subject. It is appreciated deeply by myself, by Moyo, and I am absolutely sure the audience. We look forward to seeing you all again next week, and thank you so much.